She was never supposed to be part of his world. The rain came down in sheets, turning the empty parking lot into a mirror of trembling lights and broken reflections as Emily Carter pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, her son Noah's small hand wrapped in hers, both of them exhausted after another double shift that barely covered rent. She wasn't looking for trouble, wasn't looking for anything at all, just the 10 steps to her old sedan parked under a flickering light that buzzed like it might give up at any second, but then. Noah stopped, his grip tightening, his voice small, "Mom, someone's in there," and Emily followed his gaze to the black SUV 20 feet away, engine off, windows dark except for the faintest movement inside, something wrong, something still, and for a moment she hesitated because life had taught her not to get involved, not when you were already one late payment away from losing everything, not when the world never returned favors, but then she saw it clearly, a child in the back seat, head slumped, unmoving, and something inside her snapped into place, something louder than fear, louder than logic, and she ran, her boots splashing through shallow water as her heart slammed against her ribs, her breath sharp in the cold air. She yanked at the door handle, locked, of course it was locked, and she knocked hard, called out, nothing, no response, just the eerie quiet pressing in around her. Noah standing frozen behind her as she searched for anything, anything at all, her eyes landing on a loose metal bar near the curb, and she grabbed it without thinking, hands shaking, 1 second of doubt, then she swung, the sound cracking through the night as the glass gave way, and suddenly everything moved fast, too fast. She reached in, unlocking the door, pulling the boy out into the rain, his skin pale, his breathing barely there. "Stay with me," she whispered, though she didn't know if he could hear her. Didn't know anything except that she couldn't let him slip away, not here, not like this. And then headlights cut through the storm, sharp and blinding, engines low and controlled as black cars rolled in like shadows taking shape, doors opening in perfect sync, men stepping out, silent, precise, and the air shifted, heavy, dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. Emily froze, her hands still on the boy, as one man stepped forward from the center car, tall, composed, his presence quiet but absolute, like everything around him answered to him without question. His gaze moved from the shattered glass to the child in her arms, then finally to her, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, something that made her pulse stutter, not fear exactly, but recognition of power she couldn't explain. He didn't rush, didn't panic, just walked closer, rain sliding off his coat as if it didn't dare linger, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, controlled in a way that made everyone else seem distant. "What happened?" he asked, not harsh, not gentle, just inevitable, and Emily swallowed, her voice catching before she forced it out. He wasn't breathing, and for the first time, the man's expression shifted, just slightly, his eyes dropping to the boy, Lucas, his son, though she didn't know that yet, and as the child's small hand weakly curled against her sleeve, refusing to let go, the man looked back at her, something deeper settling into his gaze, something that felt less like a question and more like a decision already made, and Emily had the sudden, unshakable feeling that saving this child was only the beginning of something she wouldn't be able to walk away from. The rain did not stop, but everything else did, as if the world itself had stepped back to make room for him, and Emily felt it. Before she understood it, the quiet authority that followed the man as he moved closer, the way the others gave him space without being told, the way even the air seemed to hold its breath, and still she did not move, her hands steady on the boy, her focus locked on the shallow rhythm of his breathing as if nothing else mattered, because for her, nothing else did, not the expensive cars, not the men in tailored coats, not the man now standing just a few feet away watching her like she was something he needed to figure out. "He needs warmth," she said before he could speak again, her voice calm despite the tremor in her chest, "and he needs to stay awake," and for a second, there was silence, not the empty kind, but the kind filled with decision, and then the man nodded once, sharp, precise, and suddenly everything moved, one of the men stepping forward with a blanket, another opening a car door, their movements efficient but careful, as if every second mattered, as if his approval had unlocked something. Emily did not ask questions, did not wait for permission. She shifted the boy slightly, keeping him upright, murmuring softly to him, her voice low and steady, the same way she spoke to Noah when nightmares came too close. And she did not notice at first that the man was still watching her, not the boy, not the broken glass, just her, as if she was the variable he had not accounted for. "What is your name?" he asked, and this time it was not a demand, but it still carried weight, still felt like something that expected an answer, and Emily hesitated, just for a breath, before saying, "Emily," and she did not offer more. Did not ask his in return, because something told her she already knew the kind of man he was. Even if she did not know his name, the boy stirred then, a small movement, barely there, but enough, his fingers tightening weakly around her sleeve, and Emily felt it like a pulse, like proof. "Stay with me," she whispered again, and this time his eyes flickered, unfocused but present, and the shift in the air was immediate, subtle but undeniable, as if something heavy had lifted just enough for everyone to breathe again. The man exhaled slowly, controlled, but not untouched, and when he stepped closer, it was no longer just observation, it was intent. "You are coming with us," he said, not harsh, not forceful, but certain in a way that left little room for argument, and Emily's head snapped up, her instinct rising fast, sharp, protective. "I am not going anywhere," she replied, the words out before she could measure them, because Noah was still behind her, because her life did not pause for strangers no matter how powerful they seemed, and for a moment, something like surprise crossed his face, brief and fleeting, dawn almost before it appeared. His gaze shifted past her then, landing on Noah, who stood a few feet away, small and silent, watching everything with wide eyes, and something in the man's expression changed again, softer this time, quieter, like he understood something he had not expected to see. "Both of you," he corrected, his voice lowering just slightly, and that was when Emily realized this was not a suggestion, not an offer, but something else entirely, something that wrapped around the moment and held it in place. She should have said no, should have walked away, should have taken Noah's hand and left before whatever this was pulled her in deeper, but the boy in her arms shifted again, his grip tightening, his breathing uneven, and she knew, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that letting go now was not an option, not for him, not for her, and certainly not for the man who was already making space for her in a world she had never asked to enter. The door closed with a quiet, heavy sound that felt louder than it should have, sealing Emily and Noah inside a world that did not belong to them. The warmth of the car replacing the cold rain but doing nothing to slow the racing of her thoughts as she held the boy steady in her arms, his small frame trembling slightly as if caught between waking and slipping away again, and across from her, the man sat in silence, watching, not intruding, not interrupting, just observing every detail with a focus that made her aware of everything she did, every breath she took, every word she chose. "He responds to your voice," he said finally, his tone quieter now, almost measured, and Emily did not look at him when she answered, her attention fixed on the boy. "He just needs someone to stay with him," she replied, as if it were the simplest thing in the world, as if it did not carry the weight it clearly did for him, and for a moment, something unreadable crossed his expression, something that did not match the control he carried so easily. Noah shifted closer beside her, his small hand gripping the edge of her sleeve, his eyes moving between the man and the child in her arms, trying to understand a situation that felt far too big, and Emily reached for him without thinking, her fingers brushing his shoulder in reassurance, a quiet gesture that did not go unnoticed, because the man's gaze followed it, sharp, deliberate, taking in not just her actions but what they meant, what they revealed. The car moved smoothly through the night, past streets Emily recognized and then streets she did not, the buildings growing larger, quieter, more distant from the life she knew, until the gates appeared, tall and imposing, opening without a word as if they had been waiting, and Emily felt something settle deep in her chest, not fear exactly, but the awareness that she had crossed a line she could not see but could not ignore. Inside, everything was still, controlled, precise, the kind of place where nothing happened by accident, and when the car stopped, the door opened immediately, hands ready, voices low, and Emily hesitated for the first time, her instinct pushing back, her mind catching up to what her body had already done. "I will stay with him," she said before anyone could take the boy from her, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest, and the man did not argue, did not correct her, just nodded once. As if that had already been decided, they moved quickly through wide halls and quiet spaces that felt more like a different world than a home, and Emily did not look around, did not let herself be distracted, because the boy in her arms mattered more than anything else, his breathing uneven but stronger now, his fingers still holding onto her sleeve like it was the only thing keeping him anchored, and when they reached the room, bright and calm and waiting, she stepped inside without hesitation, settling him carefully, her voice soft again, steady, constant. And for the first time since the parking lot, the man stopped just inside the doorway, not entering, not interrupting, just watching as something shifted in the room, something subtle but undeniable, the boy's breathing evening out, his body relaxing in a way it had not before, and the silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with something new, something that had not been there before. And as Emily brushed a damp strand of hair away from the boy's face, unaware of the way the man's gaze had changed, unaware of the decision forming quietly behind it, one thing had already become clear, whether she wanted it or not, she was no longer just a stranger who had helped, she had become something else entirely, something he was not going to let walk away. The room felt too quiet for a place that powerful, like even sound had rules here, and Emily stayed close to the bed, her fingers resting lightly against the boy's arm as his breathing settled into something steadier, something real, and for the first time since she had seen him in that car, she allowed herself a small breath, just enough to ease the tightness in her chest, while across the room, Noah stood near the doorway, unsure, watching everything with the kind of stillness children learned when they did not understand the situation but knew it mattered. The man had not moved from where he stood, just inside the threshold, his presence steady, controlled, as if he was measuring something that could not be rushed, and when he finally stepped forward, it was slow, deliberate, not to take over, but to see, to confirm, his gaze shifting from his son to Emily, then back again, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that it no longer felt like calculation alone. Lucas, he said quietly, and the name seemed to anchor the room, the boy's eyes flickering open just slightly at the sound, unfocused but searching, and Emily felt it immediately, the shift, the connection, subtle but undeniable. Stay with me, she murmured again, her voice soft, and Lucas responded, not fully, not clearly, but enough, his fingers tightening again against her sleeve, refusing to let go, and this time, the man saw it too, really saw it, not just as a moment, but as something that meant more than he had expected. He stopped at the edge of the bed, close enough now that the distance between them no longer felt safe or neutral, and for a second, Emily looked up at him, really looked, and what she saw was not just power, not just control, but something deeper, something that had been hidden behind it, something that did not belong in a world like his. And she realized then that whatever he was, whatever he did, this was still his son, and that changed everything. He will be fine, she said, not as a promise, but as something grounded, something she believed because she had seen it before, in smaller places, in harder lives, and the man held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if deciding whether to accept that or not, and then he nodded once, the smallest shift, but it carried weight. Noah took a small step forward then, drawn by the quiet, by the way the tension had eased just enough, and Emily reached back without looking, her hand finding his, grounding him, reminding both of them that they did not belong here, not really, and yet they were here anyway. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, time moving differently in a place like this, until Lucas's breathing evened out completely, his body relaxing into the bed, his grip finally loosening just enough for Emily to gently free her sleeve, her movements careful, slow, as if breaking that connection too quickly might undo everything, and when she stepped back, the absence of that small weight felt heavier than she expected. She turned slightly, ready to gather Noah, ready to leave before this moment became something else, something harder to step away from, but the man was already watching her, his expression no longer unreadable, no longer distant, and when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something quieter but more certain than before. You are not leaving tonight, and it was not a command, not exactly, but it was not a question either, and Emily felt the shift immediately, the line she had crossed becoming clearer, sharper, something that could not be undone, and for the first time since she had broken that glass in the rain, she understood that this was not just about helping a child anymore, this was about being pulled into a world that had already decided she mattered. Emily felt the shift before she could name it, the way the room no longer belonged to her, the way even the quiet carried weight now, and she tightened her hold on Noah's hand as she turned to face him fully, her voice steady but firm. I have to go, she said, not loudly, not defiantly, but clearly enough that it could not be mistaken, and for a moment, nothing moved, not the air, not the man standing in front of her, not even the faint sound of Lucas breathing behind them, and then he stepped closer, not enough to threaten, but enough to remind her that distance here was something he controlled. "He is stable because of you," he said, his tone calm, measured, but there was something beneath it now, something less controlled than before. "And I do not take chances with what matters," and Emily shook her head slightly, her grip tightening on Noah as instinct rose again, protective, unyielding. "He is stable because he needed help," she replied, her voice gaining strength, "and I gave it. That does not mean I belong here," and for the first time, there was a pause, not from hesitation, but from consideration. As if he was recalculating something he had not expected, his gaze flickered briefly to Noah, taking in the way the boy stayed close, the way Emily's hand never left him, and something in that observation settled deeper than words. "You do not belong here," he repeated quietly, and for a second, Emily thought he was agreeing with her, thought this moment might end the way she needed it to, but then he added, "But tonight, you stay," and the certainty in his voice erased any illusion of choice. She opened her mouth to argue, to push back again, but the memory of Lucas's hand tightening around her sleeve, the way his breathing had steadied only when she spoke, stopped her, just enough to make her hesitate, and he saw it. Of course he did, because he missed nothing, and that small hesitation was all he needed. "You can leave in the morning," he continued, his tone shifting slightly, not softer, but more deliberate, as if offering something instead of taking it, "when I know he will not need you again," and the words settled between them, heavy, complicated, because they were not entirely wrong. And Emily knew it, even if she did not want to admit it. Noah looked up at her then, his voice quiet but clear, "Mom," and she glanced down, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he was trying to understand her next move, and she exhaled slowly, the tension in her chest tightening before easing just enough for her to think. This was not her world, not her life, but the boy in that bed had needed her, and maybe still did, and walking away now would not feel right, not yet. "One night," she said finally, her voice steady again, controlled in a way that surprised even her, and his gaze held hers for a second longer before he nodded once, agreement sealed without another word. The tension did not disappear, it shifted, settling into something quieter but no less real, and as he stepped back, giving her space without truly releasing control, Emily realized that this was not a victory, not a compromise, but something else entirely, something that had already begun to pull her deeper than she intended. And as she guided Noah toward the chair near the bed, keeping him close, she could not shake the feeling that morning would not be as simple as leaving, because nothing about this night had been simple from the moment she chose to break that glass. The house did not sleep, Emily realized, not in the way normal places did, because even as the night stretched deeper, there was a quiet awareness in every corner, a sense that nothing here truly rested, and she sat beside the bed with Noah curled against her side, his small head leaning into her arm as his breathing slowed into sleep, while Lucas lay only a few feet away, steady now, his chest rising and falling with a rhythm that no longer felt fragile, and yet she did not relax. Not fully, because the weight of being here had not lifted, it had only settled. She adjusted the thin blanket over Noah, her movements careful, instinctive, the kind born from years of doing everything alone, and when she looked up, she found him there again, standing just beyond the doorway, not intruding, not interrupting, just watching as if this moment mattered more than anything else happening in his world, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them in a way that was not uncomfortable, but not easy either. "You should rest," he said finally, his voice lower now, less controlled than before, though the authority never left it, and Emily shook her head slightly, her gaze shifting back to Lucas. "I will when I know he is fine," she replied, and he studied her for a moment, as if weighing something unseen, something deeper than her words. "Most people would have left," he said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating something he believed to be true, and Emily let out a quiet breath, her fingers brushing lightly against Noah's hair, grounding herself in something familiar. "Most people were not there," she answered, simple, direct, and for the first time, something close to understanding crossed his face, subtle but real. He stepped inside then, not with the presence of someone taking control, but with the quiet certainty of someone who already had it, and as he moved closer to the bed, his gaze softened, just slightly, when it landed on Lucas, the shift almost imperceptible but undeniable, and Emily saw it, saw the way power did not erase what mattered, only hid it better. "He does not respond like this with anyone," he said, his voice quieter now, as if the words themselves carried weight, and Emily glanced at him, her brow tightening slightly. "He just needed someone to stay," she repeated, though even she could hear that it was more than that, something else she could not fully explain. His eyes moved to her again, steady, focused, and this time there was no calculation, no distance, just a decision forming in real time, something that did not need to be spoken to exist, and Emily felt it, a shift that made her chest tighten without knowing why. "You have a son," he said after a moment, his tone changing just enough to make it feel personal rather than observational, and she nodded once, instinctively pulling Noah a little closer. "Yes," she answered, and that single word seemed to carry everything she was protecting, everything she had built on her own. His gaze lingered on the small movement, on the way Noah leaned into her without waking, and something in his posture shifted again, quieter, more grounded, as if that detail had altered something in his understanding. "You did not hesitate," he said, and Emily met his eyes this time, steady, unafraid. "Neither would you," she replied, and for a brief second, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his expression, gone as quickly as it appeared, but real enough that she noticed it. The silence returned after that, but it felt different now, less like a barrier and more like something shared, something unspoken but understood, and as the minutes passed, the tension that had filled the room earlier softened into something quieter. Something that allowed her to finally lean back slightly in the chair, her body giving in just enough to the exhaustion she had been holding back. She did not fall asleep, not fully, but her eyes closed for a moment, just a moment, and when she opened them again, he was still there, still watching, and the realization settled slowly. Steady and certain, that this night was not just something she would walk away from in the morning, because something had already changed, something that neither of them had planned, and neither of them was ready to let go of. The first hint of morning came quietly, not with light but with a subtle shift in the air, a softness that replaced the weight of the night, and Emily noticed it the moment she opened her eyes. Her body still half curled around Noah as he slept against her, her arm numb, but unmoving because she had learned long ago that comfort mattered more than inconvenience, and for a second, she forgot where she was, forgot the quiet power that filled this place, until she looked up and saw him still there, exactly where he had been, as if time had not touched him at all. He did not look tired, did not look like a man who had stood watch through the night, but there was something different now, something less distant in the way his gaze met hers, something that had shifted. Without either of them acknowledging it, and Emily straightened slowly, careful not to wake Noah, her movements deliberate, controlled, because leaving still sat at the front of her mind, the one thing she had promised herself she would do when morning came. Lucas stirred then, a soft movement that pulled both their attention instantly, his eyes opening more fully this time, clearer, more aware, and for a brief moment, confusion crossed his face before it settled on Emily, and she saw it again. That recognition, that quiet trust that did not come from knowing her, but from feeling safe in her presence, and she leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but certain. "Hey, you are okay," she said, and he blinked slowly, his breathing steady, his small hand lifting just enough to reach for her, and she did not hesitate, letting him take her fingers, grounding him in something familiar. The man stepped closer then, slower this time, as if the moment required care rather than control, and when he spoke, his voice carried something new, something that was not just authority. "Lucas," he said, and the boy turned his head slightly, acknowledging him, not fully, but enough, and that was all it took, the smallest response, the smallest connection, but it changed everything in the room. And Emily saw it, saw the way his posture shifted, the way the tension that had been there before eased just enough to reveal something real underneath. "He is better," she said quietly, more to confirm it than to claim it, and he nodded once, his gaze still on his son before it returned to her, steady, focused, but no longer distant. "Because you stayed," he replied, and the words landed differently now, not as an observation, but as something closer to truth, something he was choosing to recognize. Emily glanced at Noah then, still asleep, still safe, and something inside her settled, a quiet certainty that this part, at least, had ended the way it needed to, and she gently eased her hand from Lucas's grasp, careful, slow, watching to make sure he remained calm, that the connection did not break too sharply, and when he did not react, when his breathing stayed steady, she stood, her body stiff from the long night but her mind clear again. "We should go," she said, her voice calm but firm, the decision returning to her as naturally as it had left, and for a moment, he did not respond, his gaze moving between her and Noah, taking in the scene as if committing it to memory, and then he stepped aside, just slightly, creating space where there had been none before, and that small movement felt larger than it should have, because it was the first time he had allowed it without condition. Emily reached down, lifting Noah carefully into her arms, his head resting against her shoulder as he stirred but did not wake, and she turned toward the door, every step measured, every instinct telling her to leave before something changed again, before this moment shifted into something harder to walk away from. But just as she reached the threshold, his voice stopped her, low, steady, carrying something she had not heard before, "Emily," and she paused, not turning immediately, because something in that single word felt heavier than it should, felt like the beginning of something rather than the end, and when she finally looked back, the expression on his face was no longer unreadable, no longer distant, but certain in a way that made her chest tighten. "You are not walking out of this alone," he said, and for the first time since the night began, Emily realized that leaving might not mean being free, because something had already followed her, something she could not simply leave behind. Emily did not turn back right away, because something in his voice made it harder than it should have been, not louder, not sharper, but certain in a way that settled into her chest before she could stop it, and she tightened her hold on Noah, grounding herself in what mattered, in what was real, before slowly facing him again, her expression steady even as her thoughts shifted. "I have been alone this whole time," she said, her voice calm, not defensive, just honest, and for a moment, the words hung there between them, simple but heavier than anything else that had been said. He stepped closer, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to make it clear that he was not stepping back from this, not now, not anymore, he replied, and there was no force in it, no demand, just a quiet finality that felt more dangerous than anything louder could have been, and Emily felt it, the weight of it, the way it tried to reshape something she had built piece by piece on her own. She shook her head slightly, her instinct rising again, firm, unyielding. "You do not get to decide that," she said, and for the first time, there was a pause, not because he disagreed, but because he was choosing how to respond, and when he did, it was not with control, but with something else, something that made her hesitate despite herself. "You saved his life," he said, his gaze steady on hers, "and I do not ignore debts that matter," and Emily let out a quiet breath, her grip on Noah tightening just slightly. "I did not do it for a debt," she answered, her voice soft but clear. "I did it because he needed help," and something shifted again in his expression, something that acknowledged the difference, even if it did not change his decision. The silence stretched, not empty, but full of everything they were not saying, everything that had already changed without either of them asking for it, and Emily felt it pressing in, the awareness that walking away would not undo what had happened, would not erase the connection that had formed in the quiet moments between crisis and calm. Noah stirred slightly in her arms, his small hand gripping her jacket, and she adjusted him instinctively, her focus returning to him, to the life she understood, the one that did not include men like this or places like this, and that small movement seemed to settle something in him, because when he spoke again, his tone had changed, not softer, but more precise, more intentional. "Then let me make sure you do not have to face everything alone," he said. And this time, it was not a statement of control, it was an offer, though it still carried the weight of a man who was not used to being refused. Emily held his gaze for a long moment, searching for something, for an angle, for a reason to push back again, but what she found instead was certainty, not the kind that trapped, but the kind that did not waver, and that made it harder, not easier, to walk away. "I do not need saving," she said finally, her voice quieter now, not because she doubted it, but because she knew it was true, and he nodded once, accepting that without argument. "I know," he replied, and the simplicity of it caught her off guard, because he was not trying to change her, not in that moment, just acknowledging what she was, and that shifted something she had not expected. The space between them felt different now, less like a standoff and more like something unfinished, something that had not yet decided what it would become, and Emily turned again, moving toward the door with slower steps this time, not because she had changed her mind, but because she understood now that leaving was not the end of this, not really, and as she stepped out into the quiet hallway, Noah still resting against her, she felt it clearly, that something had already followed her out, something that would not be left behind, because some connections did not need permission to stay, and this was already one of them. The hallway felt colder than the room she had just left, not in temperature but in the way it stripped the moment down to something real, something outside the quiet space where Lucas had finally been able to breathe without struggle, and Emily adjusted Noah carefully in her arms as she walked, her step steady but slower than before, as if part of her was still listening for something behind her, something she refused to name. The house stretched out in silence, wide and controlled, every detail too perfect to feel lived in, and she kept her eyes forward, focusing on the simple goal of leaving, of stepping back into the life she understood, where things were uncertain but hers, where every decision belonged to her alone. A man appeared at the end of the corridor, not suddenly, not aggressively, just present, as if he had always been there. Waiting, his posture straight, his expression neutral, but his eyes alert in a way that told her nothing here happened without intention, and she slowed slightly, instinct rising again, protective, calculating. "This way, Miss Carter," he said, his voice respectful but certain, and the sound of her name made her pause for half a second, just enough to remind her that she had already been seen, already been placed into something larger than she wanted. She did not argue, did not question. Because Noah shifted in her arms, and her priority stayed clear, so she followed, her steps quiet against the polished floor, her gaze moving just enough to take in the details she had ignored before, the cameras placed where they did not need to be obvious, the doors that stayed closed without explanation, the sense that every inch of this place was watched and understood by someone who did not need to be present to control it. They reached the entrance faster than she expected, and when the doors opened, the outside air felt different, lighter, even with the sky still gray from the fading storm, and for a moment, she thought it was over, that she would step out, walk away, and this night would settle into something distant, something she could file away as a moment that did not belong to her life. But then she saw it, the car waiting, not just any car, but the same presence, the same quiet certainty that had followed everything since the parking lot, and she stopped, her grip tightening slightly around Noah as she turned her head just enough to see him again, standing a few steps behind her, exactly where she knew he would be, as if distance had never truly existed between them. "I can get home on my own," she said before he could speak, her voice calm, controlled, but firm enough to hold its ground, and for a moment, there was that same pause, that same space where decisions were made without being rushed, and then he stepped closer, not to block her, not to force anything, but to stand where she could not ignore him. "I know," he replied, and there was something almost unexpected in that, something that acknowledged her independence without trying to take it away. "But you will not," he added, and this time, it was not control that filled the space, it was certainty, quiet and unshaken. Emily held his gaze, searching again, pushing again. "You do not get to follow me into my life," she said, and her voice carried something stronger now, something rooted in everything she had built alone, every line she had drawn and refused to let anyone cross, and for a second, something in his expression softened, not weakness, not hesitation, but recognition, as if he understood exactly what she was protecting. "I am not following you," he said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "I am making sure nothing follows you because of me," and the words settled differently, heavier, more complicated, because they did not feel like a threat, they felt like a truth she had not considered, and that was enough to make her pause, just for a second, just long enough for doubt to slip in where certainty had been. Noah shifted again, his small hand gripping her collar as he stirred, and Emily adjusted him instinctively, her focus pulling back to what mattered most, but the words stayed with her, quiet and persistent, and as she turned toward the car, not agreeing, not fully accepting, but not refusing either, she realized that leaving this place did not mean leaving him behind, because whatever this was, whatever had started the moment she chose to stop and help, it had already found its way into her life. And it was not something that would simply disappear once she stepped outside these gates. The car door opened before she could reach for it, smooth and quiet, like everything else in his world, and Emily hesitated just for a second, her instincts pulling in opposite directions as Noah rested against her shoulder, still half asleep, his small breaths warm against her neck, grounding her in a reality that felt very far from everything surrounding her, and she looked At the car, then at him, standing a few feet away with the same calm certainty that had not shifted since the night began. "This does not change anything," she said, her voice steady as she adjusted Noah slightly, making sure he was comfortable before she moved, and his gaze met hers without hesitation, without challenge. "It does not have to," he replied, and there was something in that answer that made it harder to argue, not because it removed control, but because it did not try to take it. In the first place, Emily exhaled slowly, then stepped forward, choosing the simplest path in a moment that had already become too complicated, and she slid into the back seat carefully, keeping Noah close as the door closed behind her, sealing the space again, softer this time, less foreign than before, but no less deliberate. The car moved almost immediately, the gates opening without pause as they passed through, and Emily watched them in the reflection of the window, the iron lines disappearing behind them, a clear boundary between what had just happened and what came next, though it did not feel as final as it should have. Inside the car, everything was quiet, controlled, the soft hum of the engine the only constant, and for a few minutes, no one spoke, the silence settling into something that did not demand to be filled, and Emily found herself watching Noah instead, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way his hand remained loosely curled against her jacket as if even in sleep he needed to know she was there. "Where do you live?" he asked finally, his voice cutting through the quiet, not intrusive, just direct, and Emily hesitated for a moment, not because she did not want to answer, but because answering felt like opening a door she had not decided to unlock. "Downtown," she said, keeping it simple, keeping it hers, and he nodded once, as if that was enough. As if he did not need more to understand where she belonged. The city shifted around them as they drove, the wide quiet streets giving way to something more familiar, more crowded, more real, and Emily felt the difference immediately, the return of noise, of movement, of a life that did not pause for anyone, and she held on to that, onto the normalcy of it, even as the presence beside her remained unchanged. "You will not see me again if you do not want to," he said after a moment, his tone calm, measured, and the words caught her off guard, not because of what they meant, but because of what they allowed, and she turned her head slightly, studying him in a way she had not before, looking for something that would explain why that felt harder than it should have. "And if I do not mind?" she asked quietly, the question leaving her before she could stop. And there was a brief pause, just long enough to feel intentional, before he answered, "Then I will make sure you are never alone again," and the simplicity of it, the certainty of it, settled between them in a way that felt both steady and dangerous, not because it forced anything, but because it offered something she had spent years refusing to need. The car slowed as they reached her street, the familiar buildings coming into view, worn but real, hers in a way nothing else had been that night, and Emily felt her chest tighten slightly, not from fear, but from the awareness that stepping out would not reset things the way she wanted it to. The car came to a stop, the engine still running, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence returning, heavier now, filled with everything that had not been decided, and Emily looked down at Noah, then back at him, her expression steady but thoughtful, because leaving felt simple, but what followed did not, and when she finally reached for the door, she understood something she had not before, that this night had not ended when the rain stopped, it had only changed shape, and whatever came next was already waiting just outside. The door did not open right away, even though her hand rested on the handle, even though everything told her this was the moment to step out and return to what she knew, and Emily stayed still for just a second longer than necessary, her eyes tracing the familiar outline of her building through the window, the chipped paint, the dim light above the entrance that flickered like it always did, everything exactly the same and yet not, because something inside her had shifted in a way she could not ignore. Noah stirred slightly in her arms, his fingers tightening against her jacket as if sensing the pause, and she adjusted him gently, pressing her cheek briefly against his hair, grounding herself in the one constant that had never changed, the one reason she never allowed anything uncertain to stay too long in her life. "We are here," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, and then she opened the door, stepping out into the cool morning air that carried the faint scent of rain still clinging to the pavement, and for a moment, everything felt normal again, the distant sound of traffic, the quiet hum of a city waking up, the small details that reminded her where she belonged. She did not look back immediately, did not want to give the moment more weight than it already had, and she walked toward the entrance with steady steps, each one deliberate, each one reinforcing the decision she had made, but just as she reached the door, she felt it, not a sound, not a movement, but a presence that had not left, that had followed her even without stepping out of the car. She paused, her hand hovering near the handle, and this time, when she turned, she did not pretend it was accidental, her gaze meeting his through the open door of the car, the distance between them no longer measured in steps but in something less tangible, something that had already closed without either of them acknowledging it. He had not moved, had not stepped out, but his attention had not shifted either, still focused, still steady, and for a second, neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching in a way that felt almost familiar now. "You should go inside," he said finally, his voice calm, carrying easily across the space without needing to be raised, and Emily nodded once, because it was the obvious thing to do, the expected thing, but she did not turn right away, not before saying what she had not planned to say. "Lucas will be fine," she said, her voice softer now, not because she was unsure, but because the moment did not require anything stronger, and he held her gaze, the same quiet certainty still there. "Because you were there," he replied, and this time, the words did not feel like a statement of fact, they felt like something closer to recognition, something that placed her in a way she had not asked for but could not deny. Emily exhaled slowly, then turned back to the door, pushing it open and stepping inside, the familiar hallway greeting her with its worn carpet and dim lighting, everything exactly as she had left it, and yet as she walked toward the stairs, Noah still resting against her, she could not shake the feeling that something had followed her in, not physically, not in a way she could see, but in a way that settled into her thoughts. Into the quiet space she usually kept guarded, she reached her apartment door, unlocking it with careful movements, stepping inside and closing it behind her, the soft click echoing in the small space, and for a moment, she leaned back against it, her eyes closing briefly as she let the night catch up with her, the weight of everything finally settling in. She moved through the apartment slowly, setting Noah down on the bed, pulling a blanket over him, watching for a second to make sure he was still resting peacefully, and then she stepped back, her gaze drifting toward the window without meaning to, toward the street below, and though she could not see the car anymore, could not see him, she knew with a quiet certainty that this was not over, that something had already been set into motion the moment she chose to stop in that rain, and as she stood there in the silence of her own home, one truth settled clearly, steady and unshaken, that leaving had not ended anything, it had only begun something she did not yet understand. The apartment felt smaller than usual, not because anything had changed, but because Emily could not shake the feeling that something unseen had followed her inside, settling quietly into the corners of her thoughts as she moved through her morning routine with a precision that came from habit rather than rest. She washed her hands, changed out of her damp clothes, and moved back to Noah's side more times than necessary, each glance confirming he was still sleeping peacefully, still safe, still hers, and yet her mind kept drifting, not to fear, but to something harder to define, something that lingered in the space between what had happened and what it meant. Hours passed in fragments, sunlight slowly replacing the gray tones of early morning, and when Noah finally stirred, his eyes blinking open with a quiet confusion that quickly softened when he saw her, Emily offered a small smile, brushing his hair back gently. "You fell asleep," she said, keeping her voice light, normal, because normal was something she needed to hold on to, and he nodded slowly, his gaze shifting as if remembering pieces of the night that did not quite fit together. "The boy, is he okay?" he asked, and Emily hesitated for just a second before answering. "He will be," and that seemed enough for him, because children accepted things in ways adults could not, and he leaned into her again, grounding himself in something familiar. The rest of the morning unfolded the way it always did, simple, practical, built around routines that left no room for uncertainty, but even as Emily moved through it, something remained, a quiet awareness that refused to fade, and she noticed it most when she reached for her phone, a reflex she had not questioned until that moment, because there was no reason for anything to be there, no reason for something to have followed her beyond the boundaries of that night, and yet when the screen lit up, there it was, a single message from an unknown number, simple, direct, "He is stable," and Emily stared at it longer than she intended, her fingers still against the edge of the device as if touching it too quickly would make it more real than she was ready for. She did not respond, did not need to. Because the message was not asking for anything, it was simply there, a quiet confirmation that something had not ended when she walked away, and she set the phone down slowly, her mind working through possibilities she did not want to consider, because acknowledging them meant accepting that her life had already been touched in a way she could not fully control. She moved back to Noah, focusing on him again, on the small details that kept her anchored, his quiet questions, his need for breakfast, the way he followed her around the apartment as if nothing outside of it existed, and for a while, it worked, the normalcy settling in just enough to dull the edges of everything else, until a knock at the door broke through it, soft but deliberate, not loud, not rushed, but certain. In a way that immediately pulled her attention back to the present, Emily stilled, her body reacting before her thoughts could catch up, her gaze shifting toward the door as Noah looked up at her, waiting, and for a moment, she considered ignoring it, letting it pass, because that would be the simplest choice, the safest one, but something in the rhythm of that knock told her it would not be repeated, not because it needed to be, but because whoever stood on the other side already knew she would answer. She moved slowly, her steps careful, her mind clear in a way that only came when something mattered, and when she reached the door, her hand paused just above the handle, the silence on the other side stretching just enough to make her aware of everything that had led to this moment, everything that had already changed, and as she finally opened it, she understood one thing with complete certainty, that whatever stood waiting for her now was not random, not accidental, but part of something that had begun the moment she chose not to walk away in the rain. The door opened slowly, not because Emily was unsure, but because she needed that extra second to prepare for whatever stood on the other side, and when it did, she was not surprised to see a man in a dark suit standing there, his posture straight, his expression calm but purposeful, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be understood. He did not step forward, did not try to enter, he simply waited, giving her just enough space to choose, and that alone told her everything she needed to know about who had sent him. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice respectful but firm, "I was asked to deliver something to you," and Emily held his gaze for a moment, her instincts sharp, measuring, before glancing briefly behind her to make sure Noah was still in the kitchen, still safe, still within reach, and then she shifted slightly, not inviting him in, but not closing the door either, maintaining a line she refused to cross. "You can leave it," she replied, her tone controlled, and the man nodded once, stepping forward just enough to place a small, carefully sealed envelope in her hand, the gesture precise, deliberate, and when she took it, she felt the weight of it immediately, not heavy in size, but in what it represented. "He said you would understand," the man added quietly, and for the first time, Emily's expression shifted, not outwardly, but enough that she felt it, the subtle tightening in her chest, the recognition that came without needing explanation. The man stepped back then, not lingering, not waiting for a response, and within seconds, he was gone, leaving the hallway exactly as it had been before, silent, ordinary, as if nothing had just happened, but Emily knew better, because the envelope in her hand said otherwise. She closed the door slowly, the soft click echoing in the apartment, and for a moment, she did not move, her fingers resting against the edge of the paper as if opening it would confirm something she was not ready to face, and yet she already knew it would not stay closed for long. "Mom," Noah's voice came from behind her, quiet but curious, and Emily turned, forcing a small smile as she walked back toward him, slipping the envelope onto the counter for just a second, long enough to reassure him, long enough to keep the moment normal. "It is nothing," she said gently, brushing his shoulder, but even as she spoke, her gaze returned to it, drawn back by something she could not ignore. After a few minutes, once Noah was distracted again, she picked it up, her fingers steady despite the quiet tension building beneath them, and she opened it carefully, the sound soft but final, and inside there was no long message, no explanation, just a single card, thick, minimal, with a name she had not needed to be told, and beneath it, a number, handwritten, precise, intentional, and one line that made her breath pause for just a second longer than it should have: "You saved him. I do not forget that. And I do not walk away from what matters." And Emily stared at it, the words simple, direct, but carrying something deeper than they appeared, something that reached past obligation and into something far more personal. She set the card down slowly, her mind quieter than she expected, not overwhelmed, not afraid, but aware, deeply aware that this was not a gesture meant to close a chapter. It was one meant to open something else entirely, something that did not demand, but waited, certain that it would not be ignored. She moved to the window without thinking, her eyes drifting down to the street below, and though there was nothing there, no car, no sign of anyone watching, she felt it again, that same presence, not in a physical way, but in the certainty that he had not stepped out of her life when she walked away, he had simply changed the distance. Behind her, Noah laughed softly at something small, something simple, and the sound grounded her again, reminding her of what mattered, of what she would protect no matter what came next. But as she looked back at the card one more time, one truth settled clearly, steady and undeniable, that some people did not force their way into your life, they simply made it impossible for you to pretend they were not already there, and whatever this was, whatever had begun in the rain, it was not something she could ignore anymore.